All right. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone, and barakallahu fikum for attending. Inshallah, today we actually have the theme to talk about with Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam. So, certainly, uh, yesterday and the day before yesterday, we were still always, well, for the past few days, we had been at the story of Prophet Ibrahim and his debate with his own people. So at the end, here comes the theme. وَحَاجَّهُ قَوْمُهُ قَالَ أَتُحَاجُّونِي فِي اللَّهِ وَقَدْ هَدَانِ. So that was the debate, and then certainly they stood against him. There was that opposition, but it wasn't just a verbal opposition. They definitely were not going to allow him to put his argument and oppose their lifestyle and just stay quiet about it. They were certainly going to put a stop, and not only a stop, but a fierce stop and a complete elimination to the idea, to the legacy, and to everything that was said. So, what did they do? We already know that they had thrown him in the fire, but then certainly that wasn't the only thing that they were going to do. They were certainly going to do a lot more than that. But the ayah here focuses on Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam and what actually happened with him and what lessons we can learn from all of that. So basically, وَقَدْ هَدَانِ, that's to focus on one, the whole idea that hidayah is actually coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or guidance comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or knowing and getting to certainty is actually from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, all the different philosophies. Yesterday, we had someone ask the question, the difference between philosophy and wisdom. And we said philosophy is more studying the different ways of how we can understand thoughts, how we can understand ideas, etc., how we can understand different things. But wisdom is more practical. Wisdom is to lay out the different ideas, decision making, and putting it into practice. Someone can discuss a different philosophy and just go left and right and tell me all the different philosophies out there to understand probably pain and to understand morality and all of that. But then you can lay out those different philosophies, but then wisdom is knowing how to put it into practice and getting to what actually eliminates evil and what eliminates the biggest harm. So wisdom is putting things into practice. Philosophy can be more of a discussion, and a person can have a PhD in philosophy and can have zero wisdom. This is absolutely normal. And this is absolutely something that we had seen. They can be philosophers with PhDs, but zero wisdom. It's a completely different thing. Experience, making decisions is a completely different thing. Okay, so وَلَا أَخَافُ مَا تُشْرِكُونَ بِهِ. I do not fear what you associate partners with, and we went in details with the pronoun مَا تُشْرِكُونَ بِهِ. Does this mean what you associate partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Means I'm not afraid of those deities that you associate partners to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Or does it mean وَلَا أَخَافُ مَا تُشْرِكُونَ بِهِ at the end, that I'm not afraid of what you would think, that whatever deities that you would believe in and what they might cause me, because I know that they don't have the power to harm and they don't have the power to benefit. إِلَّا أَن يَشَاءَ رَبِّي شَيْئًا. We said that this is an exception unless Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wills something. And we said that even if we already know that it is inevitable that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would give the mu'mineen victory, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would give the salihin, the protection, but it can happen that some of the pain the salihin may inflict, certainly even the anbiya. So is it as a result of perhaps maybe a sin one might have committed, or as a result of a hikmah or something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may have the wisdom to why He may let certain things actually take place as a result of perhaps, let's say, natural things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had let different things take place without divine intervention every time something happens. So this is important to keep in mind, that not every single time something evil happens, when evil takes place, it doesn't mean that there's going to be a divine intervention every single time, but the Lord Almighty will let things pass, and therefore we have to do what is necessary in order to change the odds. In order to change the odds. And that was the case when we were talking about the time of the Prophet ﷺ, whether we were talking about when the Muslims were persecuted in al-Hudaybiyah, or the Muslims were persecuted in Mecca, or the Muslims were going through some hardships in Medina, or probably in Hunayn, etc. Yes, even the Prophet ﷺ or the Muslims were defeated in Hunayn, at least in the beginning, were defeated in Hunayn, and then subhanAllah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala changed the odds. So when we would put those investments in place, that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to do. And that's why He said, أَعِدُّوا لَهُمْ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُم مِّن قُوَّةٍ. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, أَعِدُّوا لَهُمْ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُم مِّن قُوَّةٍ. So we would have to prepare and put in all the necessary things in order to change the odds and not expect the divine intervention. And that's the same thing with our own life. Don't expect everything to basically just change as how you want it to change, without you putting in the contribution, the investment to basically changing everything. You have to make the change. وسع ربي كل شيء علما أفلا تتذكرون. And this is always the statement after recognizing that the Lord Almighty, that He has a certain system in this universe, and then therefore anything that He would will within the system. What do we mean by will within the system? Will to mean that certain pains might take place, certain fears, certain evils, certain things might take place. That's because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically willed and had the knowledge to why He lays out the universe to work in that way. And the Lord Almighty is not an impulsive Lord to change the odds and to change the system just because of one or two, or even whatever the situation was. وَسِعَ رَبِّي كُلَّ شَيْءٍ عِلْمًا. The Lord Almighty's knowledge goes beyond all and encompasses all, and does not change due to the different odds. Doesn't change due to the different odds. وَسِعَ رَبِّي كُلَّ شَيْءٍ علما. And then أفلا تتذكرون. Why أفلا تتذكرون? أفلا تتذكرون, because certainly He was trying to give them the different wisdom to recognize the system, that if the Lord Almighty is basically the one that encompasses all the ilm, and if He is the one that gives security, then why should I be afraid of your own idols? Why should I be afraid of you personally? Why should I be afraid of what you're threatening me with, and not be afraid of the Lord Almighty and take His principles as the principles that truly matter? And that's why وَكَيْفَ أَخَافُ مَا أَشْرَكْتُمْ. So أَفَلَا تَتَذَكَّرُونَ. What is the idea? The idea is, why would I be afraid of what you associated partners with? In other words, they do not harm, and certainly they're not going to give me benefit either. So why should I be afraid of all of that? Well, of course, when you look at the tadhakkarun, if you're not understanding what it is, go further in the ayah to tell you what the theme is. So the first theme is وَكَيْفَ أَخَافُ مَا أَشْرَكْتُمْ. That's the first thing. Why should I be afraid of what you associate partners with? Why should I be afraid of what you're threatening me with? When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had not given you a sultan, the Lord Almighty did not give you the evidence, did not give you the wahy to approve and affirm your claims, then therefore, فَأَيُّ الْفَرِيقَيْنِ أَحَقُّ بِالْأَمْنِ? Which of the two groups? Is it my group or is it your group that should be feeling secure, that should be feeling safe, that should be feeling that they have the argument in place? In kuntum ta'lamun. Why was he focusing on the part about ilm? Because they were claiming that there was a good argument to their ideology in worshiping the stars, the moon, etc., and those different things in space. They were claiming that they had the knowledge. So he was basically showing them the different things in the system, showing them in terms of volume, in terms of energy, in terms of power, in terms of presence, that all of that basically would cease to be God because they fail to be present all the time. They fail to keep their energy all the time. They fail to bring life to their own selves, and therefore they would simply fail to be the gods that would mean to give us life and to give us energy or to give us existence or power, whatever it is, and the list goes on and on. Therefore, they will cease to give us security as well. So then, الذين آمنوا ولم يلبسوا إيمانهم بظلم أولئك لهم الأمن وهم مهتدون. And we talked about the hadith that is in Sahihain, that the Sahaba understood this ayah, that anybody that would, the word is yalbisu, anybody that would put in a cloak or mix good and evil in their actions, that they should be afraid that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would hold them accountable for it. But like we said, the word yalbisu actually means to wear something. We're talking about to wear something, W-E-A-R, not W-A-R-E. Okay, so we're talking about to wear something, to put something on. It could also mean yalbisu min al-lubs. Lubs is basically to mean when something is murky or something is not clear enough and it is blurry, that it's basically covered with one another. You can't really tell them apart. Okay, so that's those meanings right there for yalbisu, to put on a garment, whether it's to put on a garment of faith and basically come in as, yes, I'm doing something that the religion basically teaches, and here I am, and giving it a halal label. And especially during our times, the times of postmodernism, you would see this frequently. They would basically consider that different, let's call them the different liberal choices, the different liberal interpretations, they would consider it as a religious interpretation and something approved by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And certainly with the whole idea of postmodernism, emptying words of their own meaning and emptying words of what they contain, and certainly then playing with this deconstructive and deconstruction philosophy, and basically considering that we can then redefine the words in our own way and making their own definition of religion. And certainly if you make your own definition of religion, you make your own definition for each and every single word. That definitely is emptying Islam out of what it was actually coming with, which is al-wahi and what the Quran and Sunnah had said. And then right now we would see people that would call themselves sheikh or sheikha, or people that would call themselves that they had studied at maybe Chicago University, or maybe what is it, Brown University or whatever it is, or maybe even Harvard, they would empty the words of what they are actually saying based on Quran and Sunnah, and they would basically bring in a new interpretation. And this is the era that we're in order to be careful of that, which is putting a halal label, putting a religious label, or putting a label that probably might say that it was coming from Quran and Sunnah. They'll be taking the words out of context from the Quran and from the Sunnah and say, I'm actually making the interpretation from Quran and Sunnah. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَلَمْ يَلْبِسُوا إِيمَانَهُمْ بِظُلْمٍ أُولَٰئِكَ لَهُمُ الْأَمْنُ. The other interpretation, لَمْ يَلْبِسُوا إِيمَانَهُمْ بِظُلْمٍ, in other words, they would not. And of course, this is the verbal interpretation. Okay, now we're going to get to the hadith to actually explain to us what that means. Okay, so the other interpretation would be those that would believe and did not mix with their faith of any oppression with anything wrong. Dhulm can be major sin and can be minor sin. And that's what the Sahaba understood. The Sahaba understood that if you would confuse and mix some faith and some sin or major sin with your faith, or with, and when we say with your faith, this isn't talking about just aqidah, but this would include your salah is faith. The way you treat your mother is faith. The way you treat people on the street is faith. The way you treat your own pet, the way you treat the people in the world, the way you would relate with politics, economy, all of that, that is faith. So when we speak about faith, we're not talking about here dhulm to mean only shirk, okay? But faith in general would actually include all. So the Sahaba understood that, and they said, okay, if we would basically not be able to be committed to that one because we may have probably looked at the wrong thing, said a wrong word, probably done something that we may be aware of and we may not be aware of, because we would have probably given ourselves a religious justification that it was fine to do. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أُولَٰئِكَ لَهُمُ الْأَمْنُ, only if they did not confuse these parameters, وَهُمْ مُهْتَدُونَ, and they would be the ones guided. That's what that interpretation is, what the Sahaba were afraid of. Then the Prophet ﷺ comes to explain it and said, well, no, what is actually intended in this ayah in regards to dhulm is not necessarily the wrong sins or the sins that you might commit, but it's actually shirk itself. So that comes in as a soothing in a piece of information to the Sahaba, because they were afraid that if I were to engage in any sin, then I would not be a part of those that would have that would have the security or the peace or even the guidance. وَتِلْكَ حُجَّتُنَا آتَيْنَاهَا إِبْرَاهِيمَ عَلَى قَوْمِهِ نَرْفَعُ دَرَجَاتٍ مَّن نَّشَاءُ. So we said the word tilka actually means a demonstrative pronoun. So it's telling us, okay, all of that was mentioned before is actually the argument that was given to Prophet Ibrahim, and therefore نَرْفَعُ دَرَجَاتٍ مَّن نَّشَاءُ. نَرْفَعُ دَرَجَاتٍ مَّن نَّشَاءُ, we would elevate the steps, or we would elevate the positions. So the word darajat, the word daraja can mean a step. Okay, step 1, step 2, step 3, and could also mean a position. Okay, could also mean stage. So we're speaking about stages. At certain stages are higher than other stages. That's a darajat as well. So when you're looking at narfa darajat man nasha, let's look at al-Qurtubi and see what he had said. Okay, and narfa darajat man nasha, right there, he said, نرفع درجات من نشاء, to mean بالعلم والفهم, in knowledge and in comprehension. الفهم is basically comprehension. It's not enough to understand something. And this is very important to keep in mind. You can have your degrees, your college degrees, and you can probably be a professor and whatever it is, but that's completely different than wisdom. Wisdom is based on experience, is based on deep understanding of life. It's completely different than understanding the different theories that you might study in science. Just always keep this one in mind, to always respect and appreciate your parents and what they had contributed in your life. Because you can have all these degrees, but then your parents had lived long enough to basically give you a different kind of a degree. What degree? That is the degree of comprehension, the degree of understanding. Another daraja also means al-imama wal-mulk. What is al-imama? Al-imama means to be in leadership. Al-mulk means to be in authority. Okay, so if we're looking at نرفع درجات من نشاء, was he actually given ilm, knowledge, or understanding and comprehension, leadership, or authority? So in general, درجات من نشاء or درجات من نشاء, with the two different qira'at, okay, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us that there is another momentum that basically works in the background that you may not realize. When one puts in a certain investment, whether we're speaking about energy, whether we're speaking about legacy, whether we're speaking about money, no matter what force and what momentum you had put, it basically would create a certain momentum where it starts working on ground, whether in your children, whether in economy, whether in politics, whether in authority, whether in imposing a certain understanding in people. All of that is actually true. Whether it is of good or whether it is of evil, it would still have a certain amount of power in leadership, in authority, in understanding, in comprehension, in different ways of how it affects. In other words, it works on ground. And many times we would think of force as only being something that is related to physics that we could see. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is actually here telling us and giving us the inference that no, there are certain darajat, there are certain powers, there are certain momentums that work beyond matter. And those momentums that work beyond matter, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us, yes, it could even be an investment that many might not have recognized, such as a momentum, a word of truth that one might say. A word of truth one might say that you didn't recognize. You know, I have this story. I'll never forget, really. It gives me the goosebumps. A little irrelevant, but I would like to share it despite. You know, one time, Gems of Light was doing things on ground in helping women with domestic violence or just different things that women might need support for. And one day I get this phone call, and it was a woman that said, Sheikh Aisha, can you please help me? I said, okay, where are you? And she said, I don't know. I said, well, I won't be able to help you unless you would tell me, whose phone is this? She said, it's not my phone. I said, okay, whose phone is it? And she said, it's this person I found on the street. I said, okay, give them the phone. They should be able to tell me the address. So indeed, I talked to this person. It was an American person. I said, can you give me the location of where you're at? And are you related to the person that just called me? He said, no. I just see this woman running down the street carrying this baby in these diapers. And that was basically it. And she just said the word phone, phone. So here I am. I said, okay, can you just give me the address to the nearest location that you're in, and I will come over. It was a little bit of a distance, but I still had to go because definitely the girl's voice speaking in Arabic in America, definitely something really odd you will not get very often. So I basically just make this long drive and actually go pick her up. She was in these very shabby clothes, and her baby was basically in these diapers, and I basically just take her, and I'm like, what's going on? And she was telling me that her husband was forcing her to do inappropriate things, you know what I'm talking about, and with his friends, and she needed to run away from all the situation. So I take her to my house, and she just said, can I please call my parents and just let them know that she had run away from her husband's house and that she is with me? I said, sure. Her family is from a village next to the main city that I come from, Al Khalid. So puts them on WhatsApp and basically calls them. Her father says, well, who's the family that you're staying with? She said she's a Palestinian woman and this is her name. And he said, I don't know her name. Tell me her father's name. And I tell him my father's name. And he said, nope, tell me her grandfather's name. And then he tells me, yes, I know her grandfather. Well, he tells her, I know her grandfather. Her grandfather was a friend of mine. And her uncle, that is my uncle, almost 25 years ago, I then confirmed it with my uncle and said, do you know this man's name? And he said, yes. And I said, what do you know about this man? He said, one time, 25 years ago, my car, we had a snowstorm. And in Palestine, when you have snowstorms, it's very different because the water, the ice or the snow basically starts melting and it becomes very slippery, and it doesn't become like the snow that you would have in Minnesota. So he said, my car just broke down, would not work. We had a very bad snowstorm, and my car just stops right in front of somebody's home. And it was either I would die of hypothermia in the car, or I would get out and actually find the nearest shelter. He said, I knocked at this person's door and I said, sir, you know what I'm going through right now, but I only have your place to basically be my shelter. Can I stay at your house for the night? He said, absolutely, you can stay at my house for the night. He said, I spent the night at his house, in fact, 2 nights at his house. And then we started the car and basically, and subhanAllah, this woman at the time was 23 years old. And for a good deed that he had done to my uncle, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala turns everything around. And when this man's daughter was left stranded and in a situation where she had no help to whatsoever and no help to find, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for a deed that her father had done, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala turns the situation and lets me pay back the deed. Every time I remember this one, I cannot but I can't. It just puts me into tears. How is it? How did these things actually happen? It was 25 years later. She basically sleeps at my house, and alhamdulillah, we help her get out of the situation, but just wanted you to just see momentums work in mysterious ways that you would never think that a good word, a good deed, a kind behavior that you might present would actually come and turn around in mysterious ways to come in and actually save you or save your kids or save you in different ways without you realizing. And I could relate to this one, because when you see تلك حجتنا آتيناها إبراهيم على قومه نرفع درجات من نشاء. Of course, Prophet Ibrahim عليه السلام at the time did not have any children. And in a primitive society, children basically make up a legacy. Children make up power. Children make up what to the society actually means your leadership, actually means that you would be sustained, you would have a future, you would have a support, all that support, etc. But without you having any children or even money, to them, you would basically be seen as nothing to be afraid of, that this person is basically going to be a dying out person with nothing to be remaining after their death. That's what they thought. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, Tilka hujjatuna, that is the argument, that is that momentum, that contribution that Ibrahim alayhi salam had put forward, and as a result, نرفع درجات من نشاء. As a result, whatever contribution, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will elevate and will give one, knowledge, understanding, leadership, and authority to whomever He wills, based on the momentum and based on the contribution that you basically had invested. Inna rabbaka hakimun alim. In order for us to recognize that the Lord Almighty basically has His wisdom surpassing and transcending all, and His ilm and His power would basically go beyond all the odds that we would usually think would make sense. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would tell us that He has His own ways of what actually is the system of what makes sense. And therefore, وَوَهَبْنَا لَهُ إِسْحَاقَ وَيَعْقُوبَ كُلًّا هَدَيْنَا. When you look at Ishaq, why wasn't Prophet Ismail mentioned until the end? Isn't Prophet Ismail also part of that? But let's wait until we get to Prophet Ismail to explain it. وَوَهَبْنَا لَهُ إِسْحَاقَ وَيَعْقُوبَ كُلًّا هَدَيْنَا. Yaqub is basically the son of Ishaq. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted to let us know that from one end, Ishaq was actually given another legacy, and that basically transcended time, that transcended the time of Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam. It was Ishaq, then it was Yaqub, then it was Bani Israel, then it was, the list goes on with the different prophets. Certainly, did they necessarily keep the legacy is a different story. And kullan hadayna, they were actually on hidayah. Prophet Yaqub alayhi salam would tell his children, as in Surah al-Baqarah, ما تعبدون من بعدي قالوا نعبد إلهك وإله آبائك إبراهيم وإسماعيل وإسحاق ويعقوب. And then of course, and we are all Muslim. Now, وَنُوحًا هَدَيْنَا. In other words, letting us see, thou the legacy basically goes in the same way how Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam had basically left Ismail and left Ishaq, and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically kept that legacy as something that would elevate the name, elevate the ilm, and preserve the legacy even after the time that they had actually thought that that was bringing an end to Ibrahim. In the same way, Nuhan hadayna, even in the same way that Prophet Nuh alayhi salam, when his people had rejected him, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had eliminated the civilization and everything that the Prophet Nuh's people were basically considering that that's what is going to be the legacy that will remain, but everything was wiped out, and the only legacy that remained is Nuh's legacy, those that were in the ark of Prophet Nuh alayhi salam, وَمِن ذُرِّيَّتِهِ. Now, and from his offspring. When you look at the word dhurriya, now the word dhurriya, we talked about this before. We said when you look at the ra, it can mean the small dust, and the ra, it can basically mean like the pebbles or how you might throw things out there. But when you talk about dhurriya, you're talking about the offspring. So the offspring, his offspring, the word his, the pronoun his, is basically this pronoun right there for the ha. Whose pronoun, or who is this pronoun referring to? Is it referring to Nuh, which is the nearest noun, or is it referring to Ibrahim alayhi salam, since it was talking about qawmihi, ala qawmihi, and it was talking about lahu, meaning to Prophet Ibrahim? Is this pronoun referring to Nuh, or is this pronoun referring to Ibrahim alayhi salam, as going back to this pronoun right there? Dawood, Sulaiman, Ayub, Yusuf, Musa, and Harun. Now, when you look at Dawood is basically coming off and Sulaiman basically going off the offspring of Ishaq and Yaqub, Bani Israel. Ayub, Bani Israel. Yusuf, well, Yusuf, that's a different one, because Yusuf alayhi salam, yes, he was the child of Prophet Yaqub alayhi salam, but in terms of timing of it, is it basically putting it in the same chronology that we would know? Not necessarily, because it was saying Nuh right there and bring it after Ibrahim. Okay, we'll get to a couple things here. Yusuf, Musa, and Harun. All of those prophets were mentioned in other ayat in the Quran, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَكَذَلِكَ نَجْزِي الْمُحْسِنِينَ, and that's how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will pay back and reward those that would contribute in ihsan. Wait a minute. So ihsan is what? Ihsan is the highest level of iman. The level of iman is in three: al-Islam, al-Iman, and al-Ihsan. As based on the hadith that was basically بينما نحن جلوس عند رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم اطلع علينا رجل شديد بياض الثياب شديد سواد الشعر لا يرى عليه أثر السفر ولا يعرفه منا أحد. That hadith, okay, that a man comes and he was dressed in a very white garment and very black hair, and we did not see the effect of journey on him. And then he would sit حتى جلس إلى النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم فأسند ركبتيه إلى ركبتيه حتى جلس النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم فأسند ركبتيه إلى ركبتيه. And then what did he do? Basically put his knees right in front of his knees. All right. And then what did he do? وضع كفيه على فخذيه. Put his hands over his thighs. يا محمد أخبرني عن الإسلام. Oh Muhammad, tell me about Islam. And they said, فَعَجِبْنَا لَهُ يَسْأَلُهُ وَيُصَدِّقُهُ. They said, we were surprised. Why would he ask him? And also confirm the answer. So they were confused as to who is actually the teacher here. We had never seen him before, and we we know every single person that was Muslim and at the time. So who is this new person that's even confirming an answer? فعجبنا له يسأله ويصدقه. So he asked him about Islam. Then he asked him about Iman. Then he asked him about Ihsan. In الإحسان he said أن تعبد الله كأنك تراه فإن لم يكن يراك فإنه يراك فإن لم تكن تراه فإنه يراك. It is to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as if you could see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For if you cannot see him, but he can see you. So when you look at كذلك نجزي المحسنين, that's basically telling us that the momentum that whether in ihsan or whether in iman or whether al-Islam, whatever you would invest is basically what would remain, whether in your life or whether in your akhirah. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَالْعَمَلُ الصَّالِحُ يَرْفَعُ. Here's the word يَرْفَعَ and نَرْفَعَ again. وَالْعَمَلُ الصَّالِحُ يَرْفَعُ. الْعَمَلُ الصَّالِح, the good investment, is basically what is going to يَرْفَعُ. It's basically what's going to elevate you. What's going to elevate, what's going to be elevated, what's going to basically put in the momentum to make the change within your life, within the society, within politics, within economy. وَالْعَمَلُ الصَّالِحُ يَرْفَعُ. All the amal salih, all the good deeds, that's basically what will remain. All other investments, they will put in a certain momentum in the society, but it will not be as the momentum that we would invest in good action, in faith. وَزَكَرِيَّا وَيَحْيَا وَعِيسَى وَإِلْيَاسَ كُلٌّ مِّنَ الصَّالِحِينَ. Zakaria is basically the father of Yahya. Isa was Maryam's son. Maryam was basically the offspring of Harun. The offspring, that wasn't her father. Okay, the offspring, because of course, whether we're speaking about the tribe of Leviticus or whether we're speaking about the different tribes in the Bani Israel, in the end is that there were different tribes, and certainly those different tribes, they basically would go in different different lines, but at the end we would see كل من الصالحين. That's the key one. Ilyas was actually not mentioned, by the way, in the Old Testament or in the Torah. The Old Testament, well, the Torah, Old Testament, or even in the Jewish or Christian scriptures. Ilyas was never mentioned. Neither was Ilyasa. He was also not mentioned in any of those books. Okay? So, but here's the thing. When you look at Ilyas, we don't really know much about Prophet Ilyas. And some scholars actually debated whether Prophet Ilyas is actually the same as Ilyasa. كل من الصالحين. Why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mention him? I mean, we don't know much about him to let us know that the names Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will reserve and to give them the honor of investment in everything that they had basically done for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وإسماعيل واليسع ويونس ولوطا وكلا فضلنا على العالمين. Ismail. Who's Ismail? Ismail is basically Prophet Ibrahim's other son. It was delayed in the mention. Ilyasa. We don't know anything about Prophet Ilyasa. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Yunus. We know that he was in Iraq. We know that he was not content with how people behaved towards the da'wah. Eventually, he runs away from his people, and then basically they make a draw because they had one passenger that was extra, and if this passenger is not thrown out of the boat, then they might sink. So they made a draw on who's to basically be the passenger to leave the boat in order to keep everyone safe. The draw basically chooses him every single time, but he was a good man. They said they make a draw and again and again and again, and it always comes out on him, and they eventually throw him out, and he basically فَالْتَقَمَهُ الْحُوتُ وَهُوَ مُلِيمٌ, was basically swallowed by the whale. And certainly Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically then lets al-hut, or that whale, basically, I guess, spit him out, and then he basically sits under shajaratil yaqtin. Kind of, it's al-yaqtin is not a pumpkin, by the way. I don't know what al-yaqtin is in English, to be honest. Maybe we could look it up, right? Anyhow, so basically under that trig to protect him from the rays, the sun rays, etc. And then eventually, well, before that, what does Prophet Yunus actually do? لا إله إلا الله سبحانك إني كنت من الظالمين. إني كنت من الظالمين. لا إله إلا أنت سبحانك إني كنت من الظالمين. That was Yunus. That's all we know about Prophet Yunus. Okay. Even though there's a whole surah in his name. Lut. We know more details about Lut because certainly Lut alayhi salam, that wasn't his name, by the way. Okay. Was it his name, or was the action? Okay. Differences of opinions. Okay. So Lut alayhi salam, the people were, we know some stories about Prophet Lut alayhi salam, that his people were engaging in the wrong behavior, men getting married to men. And certainly this wrong behavior, Prophet Lut alayhi salam was telling them that this is against the nature that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created, and that this was against what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had wanted them to practice. But then they insisted that that's what they wanted to do. They didn't want the natural way of men marrying women and all of that. But certainly then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala orders Prophet Lut alayhi salam to take the believers of his family, and those were basically his daughters, and to basically leave and evacuate the city. Why? Because there was a plan of destructing that city. And we know the story of Prophet Lut alayhi salam. Okay, now Prophet Lut alayhi salam was actually related to Prophet Ibrahim. Was it his nephew? Was it, in other words, his brother's son? Or was it his sister's son? Okay, or was it another relationship? At the end, Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, what matters at least, is that Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, as in Surah Al-Dhariyat, when the Malaika had come, فَأَوْجَسَ مِنْهُمْ خِيفَةً قَالُوا لَا تَخَفْ وَبَشَّرُوهُ بِغُلَامٍ عَلِيمٍ. And what happened when his wife basically comes, and what happened? Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, he gets these guests, and these guests were basically coming in. He noticed something suspicious about them, but he puts them food, and what does he do? قَرَّبَهُ إِلَيْهِمْ قَالَ أَلَا تَأْكُلُونَ. He puts basically this he was very hospitable. He already cooked a good amount of food. أَوْجَسَ مِنْهُمْ خِيفَةً. He basically got the food closer to them, and he was afraid. Why aren't they eating? Something's fishy about them. And then certainly بِغُلَامٍ حَلِيمٍ. And they basically said that he was going to get a son. And then فأقبلت امرأته في صرة فسكت وجهها وقالت عجوز عقيم. That's when his wife comes over and she says, how is it that he's going to get a son? What does that mean? Does that mean me? I'm an old woman. I can't get pregnant now. And then they said, كذلك قال ربك إنه هو الحكيم العليم. Your Lord Almighty knows. And then she basically, خلاص, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala willed, he knows what the plan is going to look like. Now that was Sarah, and that was basically Ishaq, okay, the son. Okay, yet within the story, they said that they were also sent to destruct another city, that city that Lut was in. But then he said, but there's a salih person there. And they said, we know who's in there. Everyone's going to be safe. They're going to be safe. And of course, Prophet Lut alayhi salam was ordered to evacuate. So we know that one. وَكُلًّا فَضَّلْنَا عَلَى الْعَالَمِينَ. It's quite interesting. We don't really know when it said وَكُلًّا فَضَّلْنَا عَلَى الْعَالَمِينَ, and they were all فَضَّلْنَا. They were all chosen beyond all the people. So why were they chosen beyond all the people? But these ones, they were كُلٌّ مِّنَ الصَّالِحِينَ. You know, it's quite interesting. Well, we don't know Ilyasa for us to comment on Ilyasa. But Yunus, Lut, and Ismail, if you were to look at least their story, it was really an exception. Ismail alayhi salam, later out of his offspring comes Muhammad ibn Abdullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Yunus alayhi salam, basically later, of course, his people, later Prophet Yunus alayhi salam, basically is, since in the beginning, he was thrown out and that's it. We're going to throw you out in the middle of the sea. And basically just, that's it. We're going to wash you as you drown and die. Then we're not going to do anything to you because we're the ones that threw you in. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, فَضَّلْنَا عَلَى الْعَالَمِينَ. He was actually, you know, they thought that he was the deserted one, the one that was inferior. Well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically perfected him. Lut, when they exiled him, but they didn't exile him. Well, they said, أخرجوهم من قريتكم. They said, get them out. Why? Because they were seeking purification. That was their sin. أخرجوهم من قريتكم. That's it. We got to do something. What do we have to do? They can't be around us anymore. They're basically opposing our lifestyle. Our lifestyle we can't live without. And he's coming in and basically speaking down to us and certainly calling it a sexual aberration. But that's what is our orientation. How dare he says that? He's seeking purification. That's disgusting. That's the way that they had presented it. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, كُلًّا فَضَّلْنَا عَلَى الْعَالَمِينَ. Even though the society regarded them as isolated, deserted, and basically not having the backup and the support, the Lord Almighty is basically telling us that just as, we're going back to the word tilka, just as Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam had presented a certain momentum within the argument, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, well, there is the system. The system is you would have hidayah as coming to your children, and even al-imama, and even leadership, and even authority coming in, just like Dawood and Sulaiman were actually kings. And same thing with Musa and Harun, and same thing with Yusuf. He was also considered as, hey, the treasurer, and كَذَلِكَ نَجْزِي الْمُحْسِنِينَ. In other words, power. Yet, كُلٌّ مِّنَ الصَّالِحِينَ, it was not power. Zechariah was not given power. He was more of a pastor to them, but not really of power. Yahya, he was more of a pastor, but eventually they actually kill him and assassinate him. Isa alayhi salam, they attempted to kill him. Ilyas, we don't know much about, but at the end is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, despite that maybe the politics didn't come in their favor, but kullum min as-salihin. Each one was actually regarded in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, narfa'u darajatin man nasha', whether in power, or whether in piety, or even in giving them an exception compared to the rest of the society, even when the society might disregard their investments. The society did not regard Ismail at the time. But then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for many years later, was going to send Muhammad ibn Abdullah from the offspring of Ismail alayhi salam. And that's why the Prophet, even though the hadith is not authentic, said, Ana ibn dhabihain. The hadith is not authentic. But Prophet Muhammad according to those that had said, at least it is not necessarily extremely weak. Anyhow, what is the dhabihain? Dhabih al-awwal is basically Dhabih al-awwal, Prophet Ismail. According to some scholars, they debated if he was a dhabih or whether it was Prophet Ishaq. You know, in Surah al-Safat, يا بني إني أرى في المنام أني أذبحك قال يا أبت افعل ما تؤمر ستجدني إن شاء الله من الصابرين. That was that Prophet Ismail or was that Prophet Ishaq? Different opinions. At the end, majority of the scholars considered that was Prophet Ismail alayhi salam. Okay, anyhow, that was the first dhabih. What is a dhabih anyways? A dhabih means the one that was going to be slaughtered. Okay, and at the same time, Prophet Muhammad's father was actually going to be slaughtered for the sake of the idols. It wasn't until his Prophet Muhammad, of course, grandfather, he basically goes to the priests and the monks and whatever it is, okay, and they basically suggest that he would have to donate 100 camels for the sake of the gods in order to basically decide not to slaughter his own son for the gods. Yeah, I know they slaughtered human beings for gods. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, كُلًّا فَضَّلْنَا عَلَى الْعَالَمِينَ, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even for many years to come, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will make that be the momentum that changes the odds. وَمِنْ آبَائِهِمْ وَذُرِّيَّاتِهِمْ وَإِخْوَانِهِمْ, and from their fathers, their offspring, and their brothers. That, in other words, you may not have seen the implication of their faith in how it affected their children, how it affected their fathers, how it affected their offspring, how it affected their brothers. In other words, the most important momentum that has the power to affect and even go beyond your time, beyond your space, beyond your place, is basically the momentum of faith. Another story comes to my mind. I hope she's here, but one story, she used to attend our classes, but hopefully, inshallah, she'll come again. Her father is, well, she is Sudani. I'll tell you, she tells me the story. She is Sudani, but I was really confused because she didn't appear Sudani. Certainly the accent and all of that, and more African American. So I said, how are you, Sudani? And she tells me the story. Her grandfather came to the US on a scholarship to study. He marries a Catholic woman, and that was, I believe, in the 50s or 60s, I can't remember. Okay, marries a Catholic woman. This Catholic woman basically remains Catholic, but the father, the grandfather that is, was a religious man. He always wanted to raise his son as Muslim. And yet the grandfather gets shot and dies. His son was 12 years old at the time. And when we're speaking about America in the 60s and the 70s, there was no Islam back then. Was no Islam at all. In fact, the first time they had heard about Islam was probably the Nation of Islam, which was completely different from with Malcolm X. That was the first time Malcolm X was coming in as Muslim. Wasn't until later he went to Mecca that he had actually become Sunni Islam. And in 1979, when Iran basically was invaded, and the whole Iranian revolution, that was the second time they hear about Islam. Okay, and then of course in 1989 also things flip again after the Russian defeat and the Cold War and all of that. But before that, Islam was not something that was talked about in the media. Believe it or not, there was no Islam. It was something that was somewhere out there. That's it. And anyhow, his father gets killed. This 12-year-old boy with no direct teaching to Islam. Basically, his mother raises him as a Catholic boy. It isn't until many years later, at the age of 30, that it occurred to him that dad was Muslim, and I need to learn more about my dad's faith and just learn about it. And that's when he searched. It was called the Yellow Pages. Okay, searched to the nearest Islamic center, goes to the nearest Islamic center, and basically becomes Muslim after going to the masjid and learning about Islam. This one also gives me the goosebumps. How you would put all the investment to raise your children in hidayah, but al-hidayah is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Makes things turn around, and even when dad was not there to raise him as Muslim, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for perhaps a good deed that his father might have invested, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala turns the odds around and makes his own son become Muslim and find guidance to carry out the legacy and continue that Islam. And mashallah, I mean, his own daughter, Allah Rabbi yahmiha. All right, let's continue. وَجْتَبَيْنَاهُمْ, and we had chosen them. What is وَجْتَبَيْنَاهُم? That they were chosen. Chosen with what? Well, they were chosen compared to the rest of the society. What is al-ijtiba? Al-ijtiba is basically to anoint somebody, anoint, to choose, to basically consider above all others. وَهَدَيْنَاهُمْ إِلَى صِرَاطٍ مُسْتَقِيمٍ, and they were guided to the right path. That was the most important momentum that you can invest. That was the most important thing that you can invest in, which is هَدَيْنَاهُمْ إِلَى صِرَاطٍ مُسْتَقِيمٍ ذَلِكَ هُدَى اللَّهِ يَهْدِي بِهِ مَن يَشَاءُ مِنْ عِبَادِهِ. That's the guidance that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that whom He wills, He will guide from His servants. وَلَوْ أَشْرَكُوا لَحَبِطَ عَنْهُمْ مَا كَانُوا يَعْمَلُونَ. And if they were to associate partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, all that they had invested would basically go unnoticed, and it would basically be something that would eventually just go deconstructed. أولئك الذين آتيناهم الكتاب والحكم والنبوة. Those are the ones that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given al-kitab, the book, al-hukm, power, and-nubuwah, prophethood. Okay, wait a minute. So those were the ones that were considered as the ones to be given an exceptional legacy. Al-kitab, a certain book, revelation, al-hukm, power, and nubuwah, and prophethood. فَإِن يَكْفُرْ بِهَا هَؤُلَاء فَقَدْ وَكَّلْنَا بِهَا قَوْمًا لَيْسُوا بِهَا بِكَافِرِينَ. If they had chosen to deny it, who's they? The people that were present, not the prophets and the messengers, because the prophets and the messengers are infallible. فَقَدْ وَكَّلْنَا بِهَا قَوْمًا لَيْسُوا بِهَا بِكَافِرِينَ. At the end, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for those that would carry on the legacy and take and embrace the legacy, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would basically give the honor to others to take over the legacy. In other words, when you see yourself probably teaching Islam, or probably making da'wah, or probably memorizing Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that this is the gift that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give to those that istafayna. That's the gift that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would give for those that would be chosen. If you were honored to learn Islam, or to memorize the Quran, or to memorize Hadith, this is your first sign that it's probably Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that's honoring you with this. So preserve the rest of the honor and put it into practice. Right? And أولئك الذين هدى الله فبهداه مقتدى. Now this is a legacy. This is that theme that you must learn. Then فبهداه مقتدى. Then for you, take on with their path and learn from and through that path. اقتدى. What is الاقتداء? الاقتداء is to actually take the footsteps of one and to follow in with those footsteps. فبهداه مقتدى. In other words, take their legacy, take their example, and take it from there and walk their footsteps. قل لا أسألكم عليه أجرا. Say, I'm not asking you for a pay for this. Why? Because it's not money that I'm looking for, or what lasts. What lasts is the value. There's something even more valuable than money. It's the value of hidayah. It's the value of guidance. It's the value of carrying that legacy for La ilaha illallah, in huwa illa dhikra lil alameen. And this is a reminder for all people. This is it for today, inshallah. Subhanak Allahumma bihamdik, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk, nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant. If there are any questions, inshallah, we still have to do Tafseer al-Qurtubi with all of that we had said, but we needed to do a general tafsir for those ayat and actually look at those ayat from let's say the point that we could relate to inshallah the general meanings first before we go into the thorough meanings and the thorough tafsir. Any questions before we leave today? Okay, no one wants to ask anything. I know